service identification and enumeration. In this nugget, we'll be talking about service identification and enumeration. One of the things you'll need to do for service identification is to use Telnet. Telnet is a great utility that allows you to make a remote connection to a destination system and be able to do some administrative functions with it. Now, even if you don't have an administrator username and password, you can still get to a certain point using Telnet where you can derive certain useful information. We don't necessarily want to fully administer the machine using Telnet with administrator credentials anyway. But there are other clues that we'll see that we can get out of a Telnet session. And then we'll also take a look at banner grabbing. This is also very useful, especially for things like HTTP attacks, where we want to figure out who the vendor is of their specific web software or their web server software. Once we figure this information out from Telnet or banner grabbing, then we're going to be able to figure out what kind of vulnerability to throw at that computer. We also take a look at NetBIOS vulnerabilities, which is a very weak networking issue from a certain large company up in Redmond, Washington. In any case, this has been a long-standing problem, and I'll show you how we can exploit that as well as to get user information, such as how to find out who the administrator account is, even if it's been renamed. Now, first of all, when I teach this video, I want to try to do it a little bit differently than I've done in the past, and that is, I'm going to try to teach this video at least 95% sober. How about that? All right, as we get started here, we want to take a look, first of all, at service identification. Remember from our previous nuggets that we used Nmap and maybe some other tools to try to find out what hosts are responding, what ones answer back to us when we probe them on the network, and which ones have certain ports that are available or open. Well, once you get those ports that you see are open, you might see 21, 25, 110, 80. Those are some common ports for various kinds of service, right? Well, let's take 80, for example. What's that usually? That's right. Usually that's going to be a web server. But it might just be that the administrator on the other end is trying to play a shell game with us, and they're not really using 80 for their web server. Maybe they're using some other port that Nmap doesn't normally scan against, and it's a little bit more obscure. Maybe it's, oh, I don't know, let me pull a port out of the air here, 2275. Well, that's not one of the well-known ports, and so Nmap might not have that in its list of scanned ports that it usually uses. Now, for this kind of a web server, it's just kind of a speed bump in terms of security. Some administrators will assign a different port, like 2275 or whatever, to their web servers. And then anybody that wants access to their website has to know that at the end of the URL, they have to type in a colon 2275 or whatever the number is. So that's security by obscurity, so to speak. Now, a good hacker will eventually be able to find that port anyway, in many cases. So it's just, again, a speed bump in the road, not necessarily a way to guarantee that you'll be able to shut out a hacker. All right, for example, here I've gone ahead and run an Nmap scan. And by the way, I didn't show you this before, but you can get a Windows version of this. You don't have to know that for Certified Ethical Hacker, but that's just FYI, and you can download it from insecure.org Nmap. As with all of these tools that I've been showing you, you can download them from a number of different locations. That's why I don't always give you a URL, but a Google search will reveal all of these to you very quickly. In any case, this Windows version will allow us to, again, do port scans. It does a little bit differently. The interface is different. It says discovered open port, so it gives you a little bit more English there in terms of the verbiage and what it found. Let's say it found port 53. Usually that's DNS. 21 FTP, of course. 23, that'd be Telnet. So it looks like Telnet's open. Maybe I can use Telnet then to communicate with this server. And when I Telnet, here's a misconception. You don't have to Telnet to port 23. I can Telnet to some other port. So for example, if I want to know if this is really a mail server the way it looks, it says 25 there, that is SMTP, then I might want to Telnet to that port. So Telnet 10.10.10.42 and then 25 for that particular port, and press enter. And then what I see here is the host name w2ks.mail.local. If the name of the domain is any indication, then maybe this is a mail domain of some kind. Now, I've labeled that very plainly with this domain because that's what I wanted it to be. However, it might not always be that obvious. .local is also another thing. I did not want to put mail.com on the internet because that could have a conflict with some other mail server out there that's on the public internet. So .local, if you ever see .local, that's not resolvable by internet servers, DNS servers, and so we only use that for internal purposes. This might be the case if I had a division within my organization that had secrecy requirements of some kind and that was not allowed to mail through the internet. Well, we might do that for only internal purposes. In any case, unauthorized access is permitted to some degree. We see a date stamped there. What you usually do once you make your telnet connection is, what else do you type? Who knows what you're supposed to type next? Depending upon what service is bound to that port, it will give you different options for what kind of commands can be typed. And we just usually throw garbage at it. Just type in whatever you can until you get something that looks interesting. So I'll just type help here. And usually help will give you the list of commands that you can work with. Now once you get the list of commands that you can work with, you just start typing any one of these. Just start typing whatever. Type mail, type help. Don't type quit because that'll obviously get you out of here. Help, off, whatever that is. See if it asks for certain kinds of credentials and see what kind of garbage you can throw at it and what kind of garbage it returns to you. Now let's try another website. Let's just try here, www.securityfocus.com. This again is a really good security website, excellent resource for information there, and they keep up to date on the latest things that are going on. In any case, I'm going to try to connect using Telnet to their port 80 there and see what happens. Now, just because I get kicked out, and I probably will get kicked out, that frequently happens, doesn't necessarily mean all bad news. It might give me a little bit of information before that happens. Now, here's another thing you'll see a lot of times when you make a telnet connection. And that is this, which is nothing. It looks like just nothing's going on here. I just get a flashing cursor in the upper left, and that's pretty much it. Well, that's all right. You can just start pressing. There it goes. I just pressed enter. Sometimes you press enter, sometimes you hit escape, sometimes you have to just control C to break out of it entirely, and sometimes it just hangs and you never seem to be able to get anywhere, and I just have to close the command prompt window. But in any case, in this case, I pressed enter just to see what would happen, and it tells me here that they're working with simple secure web server. Something tells me that since this is a security organization, this is probably not the actual type of web server that they're really working with here. So we might want to see if this is really it or not. What we can do then here is to probe a little bit further and see if this is really that brand of firewall. Because remember, a big part of our service identification here is going to relate to what versions of software is being run, what versions of the operating systems are in play, and that way we can research for exploits against that specific version. Now for this I want to go back to Nmap because, Telnet gives you some useful information, especially if you keep probing with it and seeing what kind of answers you get back. But Nmap is just such a good tool, and especially if you use TCP connect scans. Here I'm going to do it without a ping, and you've seen me use some of these things in the past. SV in this case, which says -version light, what that's going to do is it's going to just scan more common ports there. So in any case, I'm also going to do a -0 to try to get the operating system out of this. Again, I'm scanning against port 80 for security focus again. So we're going to go ahead and let it do its thing. I don't know how long this will take. This usually doesn't take too terribly long. But in any case, it's going to go ahead and scan against it, and we'll see what we have going on with this. Okay, looks like it's done here. Well, what do we have here? It says TCP open Apache 1.3.31 Unix. So that gives me an idea of what they're probably running. And this is kind of an added bonus to this. We see that there's also a firewall in there, and it's running a semantic embedded firewall of some kind. So we can see some information about what kind of firewall they're running. Very useful information to fingerprint when it comes to trying to determine what we need to do later in terms of looking for known vulnerabilities against a certain vendor's product. Another utility that I like to use every now and then is this HTTP print, which a lot of people say it's a very good, accurate method for fingerprinting websites, and as the name implies. What we can do with this is to run it up against certain hosts. Let's pick on search engines for a while. How about www.yahoo.com, port 80, and then if you want to add additional ones, you can do more than one scan at a time. So I'll right-click and add new, and this time I'll choose www. Well, let's be fair to the competition here, google.com, and then I'm going to go ahead and click the play button down here, and this does take maybe a minute or so to go ahead and run, so I'll pause the recording in a moment and come back to whatever our results are. All right, let's take a look at our results here. We see that Yahoo, when it ran it against Yahoo, it deduces that it's probably running Apache 1.3.26 or 27, and the confidence level is 46%. You might be looking at that and you say, oh, wow, that doesn't look very confident. I mean, hey, what if you were only 46% sure that your paycheck was going to arrive in the mail today? What if you were only 46% sure that you were not going to get in a horrific car accident today? I mean, that doesn't sound very confident. Well, actually, for this tool, that's a pretty high level of confidence because it's really kind of a comparison against the other things that it could be. For example, and if you go down here, this is where we get the real results. 2.6 or 2.7, it really was a tie, 46.39%. But then it looks at other versions of Apache as well in IIS. It's only 23% confident that it would be IIS 5 of some version. So really it's a comparison. 46% compared to 23%, much better chance that it's going to be Apache than it's going to be IIS. And we just keep going on down the list here. As we go down further on, you see that it goes further and further down in terms of its confidence level. For example, yeah, I'm pretty sure that this is not an SMC wireless router that they're running there over there at Google. I mean, I guess that's okay for home use, but for corporate use, that's kind of like Billy Joe Jim Bob's router there. And then the other thing that we see here is, in this case, Google actually reported a banner when we probed it. So this is what they're advertising to the world that they're running, but in reality, what HTTP Print says is that that's kind of trying to trick you. They're really running Website Pro 2.318. You see, a lot of these companies can show a web banner that it's very easy to trick. It's very easy to manipulate it and show a different banner than you're actually running, and then try to throw hackers off that way so that they're looking for exploits that don't really apply to your server. Now, another way of banner grabbing is to use a tool called Netcat. This is also a very powerful tool that's also been called the Swiss Army knife of hacking tools. There's a number of different tools that actually get that kind of credit, but in any case, this is just another one of them. Ranks right up there with maybe Nmap. What we want to do with this is to use the tool to be able to get information out of the header of an HTTP web page. So to use that, I've already crafted another file first, and this is a very easy file to create. And I'm just going to go ahead, I think I'm just going to go ahead and show it to you in the file system so that we can see a little bit more clearly. I've created a tools directory here with Netcat in it, and I've created a couple of files. One of those is head.txt. You can really name this file whatever you want to. And you have to create this file on your own. But type head space / space http / 1.0 and enter. Put 2 carriage returns in there. Put the spaces exactly where you see them here. This must be typed verbatim, just the way you see it up here. Once you've typed that in, then you'll be able to go ahead and use this with Netcat. And then there's another tool you can use as well called get. It's very similar syntax. You got the space in front of and behind the / and then 2 carriage returns or enters there if you want to call it that instead. Once you've got those files put in there, and you again create those on your own, then you can go ahead and use Netcat, and I'm going to use the verbose method, to go against one of Google's servers. This is an IP address of one of those Google's, port 80, and then less than symbol, followed by the name of our file that's going to be used against that site to do the banner grabbing. And again, we might get a lie out of this, but at least we get something to get started with. So we're going to go ahead and do a run on this one. And what kind of information do we get here? Well, it takes a look at this, and it says that it's running GWS, Google Web Server, / 2.1. So again, just another way of getting a banner grab there. Let's do the same thing, and this time just do get instead. This is probably going to get us more verbose information than what we got with head. Just different kinds of information, though, and both good ways of getting our information. With this one, looks like it's dumping out the actual content of an HTML page there. But the thing I want to do here with this one is to go up a little bit further and see if I can get it back at the beginning of the command. Once again, it says go Google Web Server here. And, if you want to mine the rest of this for additional information, of course, you can get more information out of this as well. And what we have here is we actually have the Google HTML code for their home page there. Now, Google, I'm sure, has been very careful with this, but if you go to some organizations that are not quite as well administered, a lot of times you can get some interesting information out of this. So, for example, up here somewhere it might have information that's kind of hidden and does not show up in the actual web page itself when you browse to it, or might be remarked out, so to speak, or something like that. It can actually sometimes have usernames in it, or passwords, or some other very interesting information. Is it can also give you directory information, and it can say, these files are taken from, this server, server P : /files /web / and whatever. And you can get some sensitive information out of that sometime by using this get item with Netcat. So it can be very powerful. Next, let's go ahead and address one of the greatest weaknesses of all time in terms of networking, and guess which company invented this weakness? You got it, Microsoft. This is something called NetBIOS. Now, NetBIOS started off as a good idea, and it's not all Microsoft's fault, I think, in some respects, because they didn't expect for security to become as big of an issue as it did when NetBIOS was first getting started. Back in the old days, everybody just thought, hey, we need to have resources available for everybody to gain access to. And NetBIOS is a key part of Microsoft networking, which allows one user to access resources on another user's computer or on a server. So the idea was good. It leaves open a lot of security holes. And let's go ahead and take a look at one of the reasons why that is. One reason why is because we can use NetBIOS to establish a kind of an invisible connection to another computer, and we can do that using no credentials whatsoever. So if I go to a command prompt, for example, and I do a net use whack whack 10.10.10.42 IPC $, this is the interprocess communication share on the remote machine. And this is just something that's common with all Microsoft machines. And then a /user : and then I'm going to do it with null credentials. This is where the great power is in leveraging NetBIOS, as you can establish something with null credentials, meaning no username, which means I just got a double quotes, with nothing in between them, space, and no password. Again, double quotes with nothing in between them. And press enter, and what kind of a message do we get back here? There you go. The command completed successfully. Now, what exactly did I do here? I mean, it just says command completed successfully, but how do I know that that really gets me anywhere? Well, initially and by itself, this command doesn't really do much for me. All it really does is it establishes a connection that I can then piggyback on. And like I said before, it's kind of an invisible connection because it doesn't use a real username and password, so there's really nothing to log there. So that's kind of the beauty of that part of it. Now, what I can do here next is I want to kind of confirm my NetBIOS communication with that destination. And for that, I'll do an NBT stat, which is an old NBT stat, if I can type right. That's an old Microsoft command that we can use to track these kinds of connections. And I'm going to do a -A 10.10.10.42. You do a -A for IP addresses, a lowercase a for name resolution, if you want to do it that way instead. And we see here that I do have in my remote machine name table, I've established a connection with W2KS. That's the name of the computer that I've made the connection with. That computer also happens to be a mail server. So anyway, I see I've got some things going on here. I got a communique going on with that remote machine. Now, the next tool that you can use against NetBIOS, I've already run in advance because it does take a little while to run. I'll just repeat the command here for you, however. NAT is the name of the command. It's the NetBIOS auditing tool, not to be confused with network address translation, which is a way of using one IP address to kind of share it among multiple computers. Now, this is a different idea. This is NetBIOS auditing tool, and it's going to allow us to use our NetBIOS file sharing services to query another computer about things such as the user accounts that are on that system. This does require that port 139 is open, and that's what's going to happen when we do our net use command where we establish an IPC share connection. In any case, I went ahead and dumped this all out, and I put it into a file so that we could see it, because if I go all the way to the top of this, it scrolls off. It doesn't have enough buffer space in the command prompt window to show us everything. So I'll just show you what we've got here. What it does is it uses these files that come along with the NetBIOS auditing tool, and they have some rudimentary passwords and usernames in them. And it just does a brute force attempt to connect with these usernames and passwords. And you see it tried to use the administrator account with the password of right, and then it tried it with full, and then it tried it with demo, and then test, and so forth. And it just goes through all the common Windows accounts. And if you want to, you can create your own files with this as well, along with a dictionary list that it can compare against as well. And that way you'll increase your chances via brute force attack of being able to get a successful logon to that computer. Now, here what I've done is I've run a command called NBT scan. This is just a very small, simple little utility with a -V for verbose against 10.10.10.42. This gives me the same kind of information that I would have gotten out of NBT stat if I had run it locally on 10.10.10.42. However, I'm not at that local machine, and I don't want to be, and I don't want anyone to see me sitting at that machine. So I just do this over the network again through our invisible NetBIOS connection. And it can show some revealing information, again, about the name of the domain and the name of the computer. And here, it also shows who's logged on to that computer right now. So that can be very interesting. Another thing I could do with NBT scan, however, give it even a little bit more juice, is I can use it across my entire network. So I'll just do NBT scan -V. and then 10.10.10.0 across my entire 24-bit subnet mask for my class C subnet here, and press enter, and it's going to look for anything that appears to be alive out there. So this can be pretty useful as well, and we can get remote information from a number of different hosts by using this method. Another handy utility to use, again using my NetBIOS weaknesses here, is to use something called get account, or GETACCT here, and I'll enter in again the IP address of that remote system, and then I'm going to go ahead and click just get account, and notice that it then dumps out all of the accounts on that remote system, again thanks to NetBIOS. So it gives me the name of the administrator, doesn't give me the password, but we'll get to that later on. We can find other ways of getting the password, but a lot of what we can do in order to gain access to a system is to just do something like password guessing. For example, by looking at the password properties here, I can guess that this is a pretty lazy organization that does not require their users to change their passwords very often. Look, this person's had their password for 526 days. And has not had to change it. So that's a pretty long time. Apparently they don't have much of an expiration policy there. And scrolling on over here, I also see that the account expiration is never. I can also see that these logon hours are F just means always, full-time always here. So we get quite a lot of information about this, and we can get some information about how difficult it will be to crack their accounts. Since these people hardly ever change their usernames or hardly ever change their passwords, then I know that if I do crack a password, it's going to be good for probably a good long time. And then finally, I love this tool, enum, which enumerates a lot of different things for you. And I already dumped out some help here for you so you can see get a list of all the different things it does. But I'm just going to go in for the whole enchilada here almost. Usernames, machine accounts, and so forth. And I'm just going to go ahead and, I think I'll also port this out to a file so we can see it a little bit better. enum.txt, I'll call it. And we're just going to go ahead and see all the different stuff that it's able to get for us. This is a very, very powerful tool to use over NetBIOS. So if we go back down to where my directory is for enum, I've got my text file here, and we can see some useful information. Again, here we have our password policy. I just pulled this out of there using null credentials. I know that the maximum age is 42 days on this system. Now, you might be looking at that and then thinking about the other utility I just showed you just a moment ago and say, hey, I thought that other utility said that these users had the passwords for 500 days or something like that. Well, it could be that those users haven't logged on for that long. What does that tell me then? Well, now I have to put two things together, and you see this is where we go from being script kiddies to being hackers, is you have to be able to assemble this information into something useful. Those are probably old accounts for people that have left the company, and nobody ever cleaned up the accounts, so that's why those accounts are so stale, and the password hasn't been changed for that long, because we know that active users have to change their passwords every 42 days. Lockout threshold, this is good, none. This means that I can run a brute force attack against this system trying to crack passwords without getting locked out. By default, by the way, most Windows boxes do not have a lockout threshold. An administrator has to set that manually. And just if you're not clear on that, a threshold simply means that what I'd like to do is if someone enters in their password incorrectly 3 times, then it locks their account for 30 minutes. Now, in this case, the lockout duration is irrelevant because there's no threshold here. But if this was set to, let's say, 3 instead, then 3 incorrect logons, then their account's locked out for 30 minutes, and then the purpose of that is so that it helps to slow down potential brute force attacks. Which is where we just use a big dictionary file to attempt thousands of different passwords against a user account. And then which accounts did it get? Well, it got all these user accounts right through here, so I was able to get quite a few user accounts there. That was kind of interesting. We see some user list here. We see some groups. Here's the administrators group, other different groups that we've got. The big thing you want to notice here is this is the administrators group. Here is who belongs to the administrators group. So now I know that if I try to steal Big Admin Bob's password, then I'm going to be able to get into that organization. Whereas just the users group only has these generic users. These aren't quite as valuable. But the administrators, of course, would be. Other groups that I might look for would be something like backup operators, server operators, account operators. Those are also group memberships that I could exploit if I found any membership in there. And then finally, another tool, and this is getting to be kind of an old tool, and it's not as effective as it used to be because there are not a lot of places you can use it anymore. But this is a tool called Legion version 2.1. written by somebody called Rhino9, a hacker named Rhino9. This also exploits NetBIOS and SMBs, and what this does is it allows me to probe a destination network, and I can just enter in a starting and a finishing destination IP address, and then it will look for any shares that have been shared out on those destination computers. For example, here people we see are sharing out their entire hard drives. I used to work for a financial services corporation for a little while, and one of the administrators there, no kidding, shared out the entire C drive on everybody's computer so that he could always gain access to it. Wow, I could not believe it. Administrators always have access to another computer through the $$ share. So that really wasn't necessary. And it looks like here somebody, again, out of ignorance, just mapped entire drives. In any case, once that's been done, once you find a likely target like this one right here, then you just click on the Map Drive button, and then you can see all of their resources. It'll map a drive to your local Windows Explorer, and you can browse their hard drive as if it were your own. Now, the reason why I say this is getting a little bit long in the tooth and not something that we can use quite like we used to is because most ISPs will shut this down because they shut down ports 136, 137, 138, 139, and you can't really scan through those ports anymore through most ISPs like your cable modem providers and the like. I was able to last use this very successfully recently, though, because my ISP went through a changeover. And I knew that when they went through a changeover with some new equipment and some structural changes, that there was going to be something that was going to slip through the cracks. So every couple of hours, I would just keep running this tool to see if somebody had been replacing a router or updating some router rules or something like that and had gotten careless. Well, I had about an afternoon where I just pretty much played havoc on everybody else's computer, whoever was connected to my ISP, and was able to browse their hard drives as if they were my own. This also works best with Windows 9X clients like 95 or 98. If you do have passwords associated with any of these, for example, if it does require credentials, and most of these Windows 95, 98 machines would not, or ME, then you can also use a brute force attack using passwords for this as well. And in this next picture, now obviously I've blacked out a lot of different stuff for sake of confidentiality for this person. I was able to actually connect to their QuickBooks share. Well, I'm also a business owner and I use QuickBooks, so I didn't try to connect their share and use it directly. I just copied it to my own local hard drive, and then I was able to open up their QuickBooks file, and this is the names of customers here, so I didn't want to cover that up, and dates when certain payments and things were made, and I'm trying not to incriminate myself by revealing too much, but look at what this person's ending balance was. Wow. See, if I was a dishonest person, I could have really tapped into this person's account, gotten a lot of information. For example, in QuickBooks, your bank account is stored in QuickBooks. His bank account was right there. I could have taken advantage of that and maliciously used it or used it for greedy purposes. That's not my motivation, and as soon as I copied this over and found that I could actually see all of this, I quickly destroyed all of it. Yes, I'm telling the truth. I did quickly destroy all of it. I don't have an interest in it. At least that's the official version. Now the next thing I want to do is to be able to figure out which account is the administrator account. You see, a lot of administrators practice security by obscurity, where they'll just rename the administrator account to something else that sounds, less authoritative, just a generic username, for example. And then alternatively, some administrators will create another administrator account with that name, administrator, quote unquote, but they'll just make it a member of just some hokey group account or something like, guests or something that has virtually no power whatsoever. So they try to do that to distract the hacker into hacking after the wrong accounts. Well, what I'm going to do here is to figure out which account is the administrator account remotely without ever actually touching that destination computer. So in order to get that administrator account information and be able to figure out which account I need to attack then, what I'll do next is I'm going to go ahead and confirm again that I have an IPC connection. netuse whack 10.10.10.42 IPC $. It's not really case sensitive, but I'm using it anyway. User, and then quote, quote, space, quote, quote. Okay, now we've got that connection made, so I'm going to go ahead and clear the screen. And next thing I'm going to be doing here is to simply use a command called user2sid. It was written by a guy, I think he's a guy in Russia, who wrote this about, 8 years ago. So it's been around for a while, but it still works. So it's user2sid, and I'm going to go whack 10.10.10.42 42, and I'm going to look for the user account. And I remember seeing the user account Bob fly by a while back here in the same video when we were enumerating accounts over there. So I'll just pick a name out of the air and just choose Bob. The reason why I'm doing this is because all I really care about is Bob's SID. You see, each user, computer, and group account in an NT-based operating system has a unique SID. The ending of that SID is unique to each account, but the whole first part and middle of it is the same for all accounts in the domain. So in any case, I'll go ahead and press enter here, and I'm getting the user SID here. Now, some of this information is specific to users as opposed to groups, but the key information here is at the end. This the first user account that's going to be created in that domain had a number of 1,000. So this tells me that Bob was the fourth account that was created, because 0 was the first account. So Bob was the fourth account that was created. That's not necessarily the critical part. But what is critical is this SID, and it's kind of a strange tool because you don't go all the way to the end. You just go to the 5 there, and I'm going to press enter after I clicked and dragged, and that will then give me the ability to paste this in. Next thing I'm going to do is to use the reverse of user2SID, which is SID to user, and then space, and then whack whack 10.10.10.42, and then I'm going to enter in that SID information, so I'll go to edit, paste. Now, this is what's kind of weird about this. The last number there, remember our users start at number 1,000. Well then, what's the administrator account? And this is a critical CEH exam objective to memorize. The SID for the administrator account always ends in 500. So remember that. So I'm going to type in 500 here, and then in order to resolve this SID, which is now going to be the administrator's account, to a username in plain English, I'm going to use this command, but strangely, I have to remove all the dashes out of this. So you got to, oops, there's a 1, didn't want to do that one. I got to remove the dashes and leave the spaces. And then when I press enter, we're going to get our answer. And ta-da, we got our answer. They had renamed the administrator account, the true administrator account, to the name Sandy. So now I know that if I hack against the username Sandy and I can break that password for that user, I've actually got the administrator account. That machine is mine. And it's a little premature now, but I'll show you how you can also hack the password for that user account at a later point in this series. In this nugget, we talked about service identification and enumeration. We started off with a discussion of telnet, which we remember is a good way to derive information out of a machine. We're not really necessarily trying to, at this point, fully administer that destination machine. What we just want to do is to throw garbage at that destination machine and see what kind of answers it gives back to us. And then we also used banner grabbing, especially useful if we're going to go up against an HTTP server so we can figure out what operating system it's running, or more specifically, what web server software it's running, and exploit any of those weaknesses. We also took a look at NetBIOS vulnerabilities, which are many, and we were able to get through some kinds of, kind of an invisible tunnel, if you will, invisible connection anonymously, and be able to derive useful information from those destination machines, especially things like user information, who are able to determine who the actual administrator is of a destination computer. I think you'll also be happy to know that I met my goal for this video that I stated at the beginning, and that was to teach this video at least 95% sober. I was 97.8% sober the entire time. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.